Now, both David and Ian have given you an idea that there are indeed genuine debates going on in climate change science, and I'm going to be talking about one of them today. I'm going to be talking about this issue of whether climate change has already had an effect on tropical cyclones and other extreme weather events, because you hear it all the time. You hear that tropical cyclones have been increasing in intensity in the Atlantic and elsewhere. You hear that extreme weather events have been occurring more frequently in many parts of the world. And people have gone even so far as to blame individual tropical cyclones on global warming. For instance, there's been some inference in the popular press that Hurricane Katrina, a satellite picture of which is seen here, that somehow that has been affected by global warming in some sense, and it's like a harbinger or a forerunner of future effects of global warming. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk mostly about tropical cyclones because that's what I know most about. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the other extreme weather events that are of issue in the current climate and may be changing in a warmer world. So the big tropical cyclone seasons that they've been having in the Atlantic in the past couple of seasons, although not last season, are the ones that have really got people in the Northern Hemisphere excited. They're the ones that they're really concerned about. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out whether or not that's related to global warming. Now, scientists really don't like to guess. I don't have to tell this audience that because I'm looking at this audience and I can see that this audience has a reasonable level of technical expertise. Scientists like to have various theories or calculations that they are able to do in order to try to figure out whether or not a hypothesis can be proved or not. So what are some of the techniques which are used to predict the effect of global warming on tropical cyclones? Well, there's two main techniques. You can use theoretical techniques, and an example is the theory of maximum potential intensity, which I'll talk about, or you can use numerical simulation along the lines of what David was talking about. And I'll discuss both of those two techniques in turn. Firstly, the theory of maximum potential intensity. Now what this diagram shows is it shows the clouds of a tropical cyclone represented schematically by this white area here and another little white area there. And then there are various trajectories of air that are represented by various pathways here from here up into the tropical cyclone and then down again. Now, if you think of a tropical cyclone as a bit like a steam engine, so the tropical cyclone has a heat source, which in the steam engine is the boiler. In a tropical cyclone, it's the sea surface temperatures. And the tropical cyclone has a place where the heat is dissipated. In the tropical cyclone, it's at the top of the cyclone, which is in the upper troposphere. At the steam engine, the heat is dissipated in the surrounding atmosphere. Now, a steam engine that had a boiler temperature the same as the surrounding atmosphere would not be a very effective steam engine, as you very well know. So the same is true of tropical cyclones. The amount of intensity that you get depends upon the temperature difference between the surface and the upper troposphere, among other factors. And so you can develop this theory, and from this theory you can figure out the relationship between those two temperatures and the maximum potential intensity of a tropical cyclone. So that's one way to figure out how climate might affect the maximum potential intensity of tropical cyclones, because if you change those temperatures, then you'll change the intensity. Here's another way. You can directly simulate tropical cyclones in a climate model. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, a climate model, as many of you know, is a sort of a modified version of a numerical weather prediction model that are used to predict the weather on a daily basis. They have all sorts of stuff within them. They have physical equations which relate all of the different facets of the atmosphere and the ocean to each other. So these models are actually able to spontaneously generate many different weather phenomena. They're able to generate cold fronts, warm fronts, and they're also able to generate lows that look a bit like tropical cyclones. So in principle, at least, you could use a model like this to study the effect of changes in climate on tropical cyclones. You know, you could change the sea surface temperatures in this model and then run it forward and see how that affects the characteristics of the tropical cyclones. And that would be one sort of experiment that you might want to try if you have a very good model of a very good climate model. And that's crucial. It has to be a very good climate model. And there's a number of experiments you could try. You could try so-called idealized experiments, which are just simplified experiments that you could run with this type of model. And here's an example. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of a typical model grid. So the model has so-called various grid points all over the globe, but it divides the globe up into all of these little boxes. And what you could do is you could drop idealized or simplified tropical cyclones into a model like this and run them with a certain current climate characteristics, like certain sea surface temperatures, certain atmospheric temperatures, and see how the tropical cyclones change with time. And then you could do exactly the same thing, drop in a whole bunch of other tropical cyclones into a warmer world simulation. You could have a simulation where the sea surface temperatures are warmer and then see what happens to the tropical cyclones. So in this particular model, you're actually dropping the storms in rather than letting them be generated spontaneously by the model, which other simulations can do. So in this way, using this sort of experiment, you can figure out what would be some of the possible impacts of a warmer world on tropical cyclone characteristics, using both of these theoretical and numerical approaches. And then you can run an experiment with a changed climate, with warmer sea surface temperatures, with changed carbon dioxide. And in this particular simulation, it looks like the numbers of tropical cyclones appear to be actually decreasing a little bit in a warmer world. So that's direct numerical simulation. So you put all of that stuff together, and over the past 10 years or so, a number of people have worked on this topic and have come up with various conclusions. And most of the workers who've been working in this field tend to agree that most simulations indicate that there's going to be some increases in peak tropical cyclone intensity and precipitation by about 2050 or so. There's no real consensus yet on the changes in numbers, and what that means simply is that climate models tend to disagree on the direction in the changes in tropical cyclone numbers. But some of the recent experiments suggest a decrease, but even in those experiments, that didn't actually affect the intensity of the most intense storms or the frequency of the intensity of the most intense storms, because there's a big tail in the distribution. All of the simulations suggest that tropical cyclone formation regions are likely to stay approximately the same, and it's harder to say at the present time whether or not they'll travel a bit further poleward than they do. In other words, in our hemisphere, whether they come further south than they typically do in the current climate. So that's what's been figured out in the past 10 years or so of work using these techniques. So that suggests that there, at some point in the future, likely to be some sort of change in tropical cyclone characteristics. But then you have to ask the question, has climate change already affected tropical cyclones? And how do you decide that formally? Well, the formal way that you decide that is with a lot of work on statistics and numerical simulation. So this involves the so-called detection issue, which is basically a statistical issue. In other words, you're trying to figure out if you've detected a signal or not. Because you'll have a signal, and then you'll have noise, and you have to figure out whether the signal's emerged from the noise or not. So in order to do that, you've got to have really good data for both the signal and the noise, obviously.